And now calling the April 17th, 2024 special board meeting of the Santa Rosa City Schools Board to order. We will start off with the first item, public comment on closed session agenda items. That includes item B1, conference with labor negotiator. Are there any public comments, blue cards?
President Medina, there are no blue cards.
Seeing no public comments, we will now recess into closed session. Now reconvening the April 17th special board meeting of Santa Rosa City Schools Board. If you would all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag, United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Thank you. We will now move on to, let's see, report of actions taken in closed session. There were no actions taken in closed session. So with that, we'll move on to public comment on agenda items only. If you have a comment to make, please make sure you submit a blue card. I will be calling out your names and you will have 3 minutes. First, we have, I'll go with Dwayne, followed by Catherine.
Guess you got to put a timer up there so we know I'm on 3. My name is Dwayne DeWitt. I'm from Roseland, but a proud graduate of the Santa Rosa school system, Cook Junior High, Santa Rosa High School. I'm here to point out that it's a good thing to have the graduation requirement waivers. And the reason why is there's a number of young people who may not fit all of the specific requirements, but they need to get on with life. Many youngsters, for whatever reasons, at 15, 16, 17, they may already be starting families. They may already be working and out there struggling to keep themselves housed and doing different things of that nature. When I was young, it worked out that they called them a social promotion. You got to go to the next class no matter what your situation was because they wanted you to be throughput. Get on, go forward, graduate. That's not such a bad idea for young people, especially if they're having to work. Santa Rosa High School had a nice work experience program, which I started in as a junior. And I was living on my own as a senior, paying my way through, and I couldn't do math very well. I learned it after I got out of high school and was a soldier. And I think it's important for folks to understand that many of these young people actually get almost crippled by a bad situation if they get a bad grading situation as they leave out of high school. My high school stuff was terrible. So I want you to make sure and keep the waivers possible, maybe make them on an individual basis, but make sure that youth get to move forward. Then the alternative education recommendations. I don't know what those are specifically, but I'd like to add to them in the sense of making sure that work experience is available to all youth at these high schools. And that it not just be computer oriented. We used to have lots of shops. You had the auto shop along with metal shop and wood shop, and then the farm stuff over at Santa Rosa High School. So I'm advocating that you folks take the practical approach, looking at it like, what would you do if your 15 or 16-year-old son or daughter came home and said, hey, we're starting a family unexpectedly and wanted to go forward, all right? And I think that you folks can be the ones that focus in on that and let that be one of your main approaches for the next few years to make sure that all of our students that go to Santa Rosa Unified School District get through, get out there for productive life. They may have to learn math when they're in their 20s or 30s, but at least they got to start.
Your time is up. Next, we have Catherine Howell.
Hi, good evening. It's Catherine Howell, SRTA President. Wow, 3 minutes. Okay. Not used to the timer. So first of all, in terms of the waivers, thank you for planning ahead. That gives our kids, our families, the chance to talk about it, to plan for it, to not be caught off guard that all of a sudden their schedules need to change. It helps our counselors at the high schools be prepared for who needs to be enrolled in what class and not have to do what they did this year, which is mid-year have to call in students, figure out who's earned the waiver, who hasn't, and then go through that process with families again, trying to get those waivers processed. So I appreciate that this board is looking ahead to the future and making sure that our families know ahead of time that these opportunities are available to them and that they don't have to wait until their students fail these classes to talk about these waivers. Excuse me. In terms of the alt ed, I want to say thank you to all of the people on that committee. That list of names was an amazing group of knowledge and energy and passion, and the time that they put into these thoughts and plans and the ideas that they came up with. I think we all owe them a huge amount of gratitude. And I hope that this board really takes those recommendations to heart. The middle school interventions as a top priority is really important. As a middle school teacher, I know how pivotal those years are, that, let's change something now before they go to high school and start failing classes. And again, it's not the great time to be asking for new expenditures, but I think that this is something that we really need to consider funding some parts of these priorities and make sure that we're getting some alt ed interventions now for our middle school students. And then, of course, we've got the community schools planning grant that we can hopefully turn into a real grant that will help our elementary students along the way. So thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to our discussion items. First, we have graduation requirements waiver update. And board, I'll just add that I did ask for this to come up on our agenda as a discussion item. I wasn't here during the meeting where the board approved the existing update, but serving on the graduation requirements committee, one of the things that I've noticed is that there's maybe been some inconsistencies throughout the district in terms of how waivers are applied. So I wanted to make sure that as we implement a new, the waiver, that part of the update is what the district is doing to make sure that we're consistent in terms of our implementation throughout of this update. And hopefully that's part of what's presented. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Trinnell, President Medina, members of the board, students, staff, and community at Santa Rosa City Schools for this opportunity. Tonight's presentation is going to describe how the waiver is being implemented, including the number of waivers by school and grade level, and also obviously serves as an opportunity for discussion. And before we get into that, I do want to thank all of the members of the committee, their hard thinking, the teachers, the counselors that we consulted with, all the way down to the actual form that's going to be used on this. It can be very confusing for an individual that hasn't gone through a process like this before. And thank you very much, Superintendent Trinnell, for the guidance through this process. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Bardelli from Information and Evaluation Department to get us started with some of the information.
All right, good evening, everyone. So before we start, I would like to catch up everybody on the process around the waivers and where we stand right now. So as you all know, in December 2023, we approved, or the board approved, waivers or extended the waivers that were available during the COVID pandemic for math and language other than English for classes that were graduating in 2024 and 2025. So currently 12th and 11th graders. In March 2024, just last month, these waivers were extended for math and the cohort limitation was removed. So these waivers are similar to what were available to students during the COVID-19 pandemic and waive these two local graduation requirements of the third year of math and the second year of language other than English. So far, we have recorded 268 waivers in any one of those two subjects during this school year. 92 students receive waiver only for math. 131 students receive waivers for language other than English, and 42 students receive both waivers. When we look at the breakdown by schools, you can see that there is a little bit of variation across both schools and within school subjects. Roughly about 3% of all the eligible students applied for and received the waiver so far. When we look at grades, you can see that most waivers were received by 12th graders. Maybe it is not unexpected. Just because they are about to graduate, they know whether or not they need the waiver, and they are receiving them. We also have 11th graders that are receiving them. These are students that maybe are planning ahead or maybe they need to catch up, and this waiver can provide them a safety net. Also, you can see that there are no students that receive grade waivers in 9th and 10th grade for math. You can see the bar is pretty much 0. And we have a few students that receive language other than English waivers. These are usually students that receive this waiver because they speak a second language or because they completed through a level 2 language other than English class, so that we waive the rest of the graduation requirement credits. So what our next step now is to fully implement the new waiver that was approved in March 2024. So currently, class of 2024 and 2025 are still receiving waivers during the process were approved and rolled out after the December meeting. We are currently developing a process for the new waivers that were approved last month for class of 2026 and beyond. As part of the work that we have done with the Graduation Requirements Committee, we would like to develop both a pamphlet for parents to explain them and provide them information about our graduation requirements, UC-CSU admission requirements, and what can be waived. At the same time, we're also developing a waiver form and some information that goes with it to explain to counselors and families about the process, and so that they can guide both the decisions around the waiver and guide the meetings with families when the waivers get discussed and then approved. We hope to finalize the first draft of the waiver application during the April counselors meeting, which is happening next Tuesday, I believe. We also met last month on March 28th with the secondary counseling department chairs. And we have a conversation around the waiver and what we would like to see as the process being implemented as we roll out the March 2024 waivers. So what was discussed was that counselor would like to give waivers only to juniors and seniors and not waive too early during a high school career. And then thinking about reasons for students receiving a waiver, 3 focal points emerged during the meeting. First was whether academic needs, either where a student failed a class previously and might not have enough time during their 4-year to catch up. Next would be a social-emotional need, extenuating life circumstances or anything like that. And finally, specific post-secondary plans that might not include, for example, admission to a UC-CSU, therefore making those graduation requirements a moot point for a student. As I said before, we are going to meet with all our secondary high school counselors on April 23rd. We hope to get final feedback around the form and the guidance document that we hope to develop or that will accompany this form so that we can fully roll out at the beginning of next school year for our upcoming 11th graders. Good.
Good evening. I just want to add one thing on the post-secondary plans and course schedule conflicts. As discussed with the counselors, that could very well be a student who's trying to complete a career technical education pathway, and there might be a conflict in between a specific course for that and their chance to become a completer, and potentially, like, let's say, a 3rd year of math.
Questions? Well, is it okay if we go to one last public comment real quick before? Will Lyon? You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, members of the board and the community. I wanted to echo what President Howe said. Thank you very much for accepting the waiver that the committee brought you. I know it takes a lot of courage to talk about this, and it takes a lot of courage in some ways to support the committee that might bring you recommendations that you'd rather not discuss. But I think it's time for us to discuss that, and I appreciate that courage. I wanted to make sure that we know that the idea from the committee, which I serve on, is to bring the easiest ones first, which is what we brought, and thank you again for accepting that. But there are other conversations that need to happen, and I hope that you'll be open-minded about those and continue to support the committee. We're charged with bringing recommendations to the superintendent, who can work with the president to bring it to the board. And at that point, you may or may not agree with them, but we're really grateful for the conversation. In terms of alternative ed, we have a lot of kids that don't really fit. Like there's no, square peg, round hole. Not every kid is going to fit into any box that we make, but with some additions to alternative ed, specifically for programs for kids who are struggling and aren't being successful in the comprehensive high school system. Beyond credit recovery, we're talking about students who maybe haven't failed the class yet because they're an uprising ninth grader. We don't have a great place for them right now. For kids who are really struggling emotionally, socially, that every single adult who knows that kid would think, we don't need to focus on college. We need to keep this kid alive. We need to keep him, we got to get him ready for life after high school. We got to just keep him in the game as long as we can. There are ways to build those alternative ed programs that exist. And again, I just want to thank you for considering those. It takes a lot of courage to do anything in these current financial situations, but we have kids that need that help. So on both fronts, thank you for listening. Thank you for open-mindedly considering everything. And I'll pray with you all that we all make the best decisions available with the resources that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, board, I'm going to ask a few questions and then I'll open up to the rest of the board for more questions. You indicated that you're developing a form right now. I just wanted to, could you elaborate a little bit on the parent component of the form and when the involvement of parents in this process?
Thank you for the question, President Medina. So as it's currently standing, once the next full counselor meeting happens with some feedback about the form, the idea is then for a draft version of that to be used by counselors in conversation with some parents, as this year is probably in May, and to incorporate any kind of feedback, if there's any about lack of clarity, about scope and comprehensiveness of the information included in terms of the steps involved. And so what will be asked is that we have each site kind of like maybe identify families they're already working with and just get a little feedback on how that's going. And then that will be the final piece that leads to the quote unquote final version of the form.
And you also talked about the pamphlet. Will the pamphlet include information about the post-secondary consequences, and will that also be part of the form?
Yes, I believe there's a tradition in our waivers of having that explicitly spelled out where the signature lines are, that this will be, if you make this choice, this will be the kind of consequences and potential repercussions in terms of post-secondary opportunities. And it spells out they get limited beneath a CSU or UC direct transfer, but that's still community college. Other opportunities exist. And I think the pamphlet will include that as well. We think that's an important piece of making sure our community, guardians and students are all mindful of the potential decisions they may make, so they can compare those to 4-year or long-term plans they have for themselves and with the educators who support them and their guardians to determine what the outcomes might be of those decisions.
And in terms of training, I know you guys are working a lot with the counselors, but in terms of the whole auditing process, is there any training being done to administrators?
Absolutely. So we've already spoken with and are prepared to work with our director who oversees our vice principals, who most directly work with counselors and oversee them at the sites and the high schools. Of course, we'll work with our principals. We'll go through the finalized draft. We usually go over the paperwork with them, explain kind of the steps involved, make sure we answer any questions so they're just as informed. As a matter of fact, our plan is to make sure the administrators who oversee the counselors kind of introduce the final form, so they are the kind of responsible for being the keepers of the information in terms of bringing that forward. And then, of course, then in auditing, we turn back to administrators for the process. And we do believe it's important in there, if there's a question or a point of consideration where there's really kind of unsure if it would be the best thing to work with the family for this particular opportunity, the administrators will request that the counseling team comes to see them and that they be kind of a final guide for those decisions so that they aren't made in absence of the positional authority and awareness.
And just my last question is, are there any situations or have there been situations where the waivers are denied?
That's a great question. The first piece to that actually goes before that question. It really should be initiated by the school when the need is apparent by those three key reasons we pointed out. So it shouldn't be like students are just kind of coming in, but students will hear about it and they will come, and that is when denials do take place. They may not be completely appropriate.
I also want to add that this is, I think, in conversation with the counselors, this serves as a unique opportunity to have conversations with families about four-year planning in general, right? And also for us to gather better information about students in terms of what they need and why they would be seeking out waivers, and in general, the K-12 experience. So that was something that was made explicit in the conversation with the counselors and even came from them.
I'll open it up to board members' questions. Trustee De La Cruz?
Thank you for including some of the data. I'm wondering, I appreciate kind of the clarity around the reasons for the waivers, right? Adding criteria to them. Are we collecting criteria around what reason? Do families have to say, 1, 2, 3 reasons altogether? Like, is there a way of weighting them? Or is there a way that we're tracking kind of the highest reasons why students are asking for waivers?
We currently don't track them in the current forms, but the new forms will include those 3 reasons so that we can start tracking them moving forward. So currently we don't, but the ones that we're going to start giving out, starting from with the new form probably next year, we're going to be able to collect that information and share it back with you.
Great.
Just to be clear, it has been the case that we have had processes where it's more explicit in the past with waivers. The most recent one that was approved in December is a little bit more generalized in process. And I think we realize as institutions, it's good to go back to a more specified way of tracking what's happening so we can quote unquote audit or, pay attention to what the reasons are.
Thank you. I also noticed there's a pretty large disparity in terms of which schools are applying for the highest number of waivers. Could you speak to why Elsie's numbers are so low in comparison to other sites?
I would just start, you're speaking about the math specifically?
Both.
Okay, I do want to say that I would have to ask more specific questions myself right now to kind of be very clear on that. I don't want to make up a reason for you that I'm not aware of. So I would have to ask that team and kind of get more information and ask them what their processes are and what's occurring there that makes those maybe not being used either as often or not as necessary. So I don't know.
And then I'm wondering if we're also tracking waivers by race and ethnicity, by language, by immigration status, any other kind of important data points for us to consider around more specific or targeted is the wrong word I'm looking for, but approaches to reaching certain kinds of kids or with certain kinds of issues.
So following the December meeting, we split the waivers that were received through the form, through, these, the graduation waivers versus the waivers that we call them exemptions. So exemptions that students received because they speak another language or because they met the graduation requirements some other way. The record keeping up to December was not consistent, but starting after December, we started to split the two, and we provided clear guidance to our registrars on which course code to use in the student information system so that we can disaggregate that. Unfortunately, I can't go back in time and change what data was put into the system, but moving forward, we will be able to provide you information around whether or not, and that is, if you look at the language other than English bar, that both includes waivers of the actual graduation requirements and also exemptions from the graduation requirements because students either came from us from overseas or from another country and they actually receive language, language instruction in their first language, so they don't need to go through our language other than English, or students that maybe are coming from, French American charter schools, so we say they're already, budding bilinguals, so they already met the graduation requirement by the time they reach ninth grade.
I would add one more thing that I think is really important. If you go back a few years to when we had the individual graduation plan, the IGPs during COVID, we can look at some of those previous board reports and you can see that we disaggregated all the data by all those metrics. And I would argue that if you're going to do an audit, it should start with an equity audit that should look at the percentages in our district against the amount of waivers and what those line up with demographics. And if we don't do so, we're being, professionally a little bit not on top of our game.
Thank you. The last thing is, it would be really helpful to see to what extent our waivers are increasing our graduation rates. And so I'd just love to see that over time to make sure that we understand the impact that these waivers are having. And then the last thing I want to say is just thank you. Thank you to our larger community who's engaged in this conversation. Thank you for considering the timelines to make it easier on counselors with very high student caseloads. And so just really grateful for the continued ongoing conversation that feels very productive. So I'm grateful for that.
Trustee Sheffield?
Thank you. And thank you, Trustee De La Cruz, for bringing up the issues, particularly the ones around data collection and race and ethnicity. I think this is really important when I'm looking at these and I'm seeing the schools and where, the schools that are participating in this. There's something that just kind of, it stands out. It stands out as maybe more than an anomaly, something that data can explain. I know we haven't in the past, but moving forward, all data, we really do need to, if we're part of the implementation process is evaluation. And you can't do a full evaluation if you don't have data. So just really encouraging us to collect as much data, definitely race, ethnicity, language. And that's a big one as well. And that brings me to my second question. I'm wondering how we're communicating with families and when that this is an option that's available. Yes, we're doing counselor trainings, but what's the counselor team and how are they communicating to families?
Yeah, so I believe that once we finish the final steps as outlined above, there's obviously the information that's included in previous board meetings and in our public record. But I think it comes back down to the judicious individual decisions that are made. So a lot of the communication is about kind of judicious and careful looking at students who would be applicable based on the agreements and the criteria that are listed. And then outreach comes directly to families. There, I don't think will be like a large, like push of just like anyone come and get this. So, I mean, the fact that it exists will need to be communicated, but then it's going to have to be about the intentional follow-up with students that it's most applicable for. And I think that's kind of one of the things that we should all as an institution learn from the IGP process we went through, which is that you have to see any kind of minimum standard as the floor, and everyone should be pushing to the ceiling as much as possible always. And so our job is to make sure we don't over-communicate something that may not be needed by all, and that it is known it exists, but that we really rely on the expertise and the knowledge of the teams at schools, looking out at the interests of the students, once again in connection to four-year plans, which we need to make sure we develop in Santa Rosa City Schools and not just talk about, so we can follow through with the implementation of this in an appropriate manner.
Well, so just to follow up, again, I'm trying to get more to the root of how we're communicating. I want to make sure that we're being culturally sensitive, that we're having a conversation that needs to be had at the right time. We heard from public comment about us taking up this discussion tonight, giving our school counselors more time to be better prepared, to helping families be able to better navigate what their options may be. In that, again, my question is, how are we communicating this to the families, especially maybe families that English is not the language spoken at home?
So I can get the specifics of that for you and circle back. I do know that in the meetings that we've been having with the counselors, the impression that I've gotten is that like what they have come to us is to get the information on how they can get that information out to their families. So I didn't get the impression that they weren't. And for me, it was like, how can we best get it to them? And what are the parameters that they could best communicate, right? So in terms of the specifics and how we're doing that outreach, I can circle back and actually get some more of the specifics in terms of like, you mean like whether or not we're reaching out to families in their language and whatnot. I can check on those specifics, yeah.
I'd like to add that it really, what the board is bringing up is really critical for us to pay attention to. And that is, we know that as individual schools, they have different graduation rates. And while our high schools in particular have different enrollment numbers, so equal is not equal, we also know that graduation rates are they're very different school to school. And so our diligence in one, not assuming that because students are at one particular school, waivers should be higher. It really is a matter of, are we being diligent in making sure that this information is available, right, to our families so that they can assist their child in making decisions for their future. And I think we need to pay attention to the inequities that could be happening as a result of the way communication is or isn't happening. So I appreciate the questions, and we will provide you follow-up information, probably an information item, so that it will be memorialized in our agenda and provide the board additional opportunity. It gives us that opportunity to go back to our teams and ask, because we have our counselors who are doing some of this work, but we have administrators, we have teachers who we have also tapped into for their perspective on how we move forward. And so we all have a responsibility at the school site when we see students who may not be performing or seeing success in the way that we think they should or the way they think they should, that we are serving them.
Thank you.
Just real quick on that question.
Yeah.
Is it part of the SST process too? Do the SSTs address this?
So it could be a part of an SST, although those are typically held for different reasons. We have our MTSS process, which has tier 1 and tier 2 teams at school sites that should be looking at students who are struggling for a variety of reasons. So we should be looking at how this is filtering in students and having conversations around that too for prevention and intervention.
Yeah, and I know that they're also presented at LARCs, for example. We have evidence that they've been presented at ELACs, and so, but I do appreciate the question, and I will get you more specific information. From my end, and I'm glad that you asked the question. From my end, I see that people are pressing us for the information, so I don't bother to ask back that, that what are you doing? We're answering for them, so I appreciate that, and I will get that information.
Great, thank you. And then the last question I had, this came from the suggestions from counselors about the waivers only for juniors and beyond. I think that was on slide 7. I'm just wondering, for what we currently do, there are waivers for languages other than English and I see currently 9th and 10th graders. Is that something that we will no longer be doing? We will be.
Those will still be given out as exemption for the graduation requirements.
Got it.
Under what we call Exhibit 5 from our graduation policy, which is students that have met the language other than English graduation requirements in other ways. So usually there are 2 ways currently that students can pursue that. The first one is whether for each year of secondary instruction after 7th grade or 7th grade and beyond that they receive in a language other than English, they can waive 1 year of language other than English. I don't know if that makes any sense. So let's say that we have a student that completes 7th and 8th grade in Italy, and then they move back here and they enroll as the 9th graders at Santa Rosa City Schools. They can receive a waiver for those 2 years of middle school in Italy just because we say you have met your graduation requirement because you receive formal secondary education in a language other than English. So they can waive a year for each year that they receive. So that is the first time, one case that a ninth grader could receive a waiver for that graduation requirement. The second one is a student that has placed in and successfully completed a level 2 language other than English class. And by level 2 means the second year of a language other than English. So a student that, for example, places and completes a Spanish 2 class, they will meet the graduation requirement even if they haven't taken Spanish 1. So, for example, we have a few students that complete 2 years of Spanish in middle school, and they qualify and enroll in Spanish 2 as ninth graders. Our current graduation policy allows them to waive the other 10 credits of language other than English because they have already met the minimum requirement for admission to the UC. So those are the only 2 ways in which you can receive a language other than English exemption, that we call them, because they met the graduation requirement already. But then afterwards, right, let's say that you just have 10 credits of English, but you are an 11th grader, then you can apply for the current waiver in case you want to enroll in a CTE class and you don't want to trade your 10 credits of elective out of a CTE program instead of taking a language other than English. And that instead would be an actual waiver. I don't know if
No, that totally makes sense.
Perfect.
Yes, absolutely. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
And I have Trustee Flores, followed by Trustee De La Torre.
Thank you. So in slide number, by the way, thank you for the presentation. And I want to reiterate what my fellow trustees have said. I hate to say this yet again. When I see data here, I expect this to be, included with, the segregation of, not segregation, what's the word I'm looking for?
Desegregation.
Desegregated data in terms of ethnicity, right? So, I think that's something we've asked, not once, not twice, but consistently in this board. So, just keep that in mind. And then 2, in terms of the exemption versus the waiver. So I'm looking at slide number 5, and then there were like 4 ninth graders with a waiver, right? There are 4 ninth graders that are waiving LOTE. So my idea of the waiver is that, we give students opportunities to take the classes, right? Not talking about exemptions, not talking about AB 2121, not talking about those special, these waivers are for students who, for one reason or another are struggling, right? By the time, for graduation purposes, right? Not exemptions. So how does a ninth grader, 4, are waived in here already?
So our policy, which we did not change, the policy has existed that students who come with experience, maybe probably their native language.
No, I understand that. So there is a difference between exempting that because they've already met the requirement, and waiving, because the waiver that we're talking about here, is for graduation purposes if they are having difficulties for graduation purposes, right?
Yeah.
Not, because they took, they were in a foreign country and the language of instruction was Thai or Spanish or whatnot.
Yeah, I believe these are recording issues in our SIS where the wrong course code was used when the exemption was recorded into the system. And we just disaggregated those 2 course codes starting December. So these are likely students that received them before the original waiver was passed. And before December, we were using just 1 course code for everything. So we are not able to disaggregate what now we call the exemption versus the waiver. Now we actually have 2 different course codes that we can use, but that will fix the data moving forward. But looking back at this year, those will be included just because we reuse the course code.
That makes sense to me because I'm a school counselor and I know exactly what you're talking about. So hey, it might have gone over people's heads. So, and then the other thing I would like to include here is it's data about the other, graduation exemptions that we have, or not waivers, but exemptions, in terms of AB 1806, for example, or AB 2121, where the graduation requirements it's minimized to the state minimum. So, and when the data comes back from, I think it was Director de la Cruz who was suggesting to have that information be brought here, I would like to see how many of our students are also, taking advantage or are actually being identified in those specific bills for that waive full graduation requirements.
Yeah, I was just waiting for school to be over so that we could give you the actual numbers. We will also be reporting them to the state because for the first time they are requiring us to report students that are graduating, waiving local graduation requirements. So that's definitely something we can share with you.
Got it. All right, thank you.
Trustee de la Torre?
Thank you guys very much for this information. I'm gonna talk about it as well, because the more of us talk about it, the more it's gonna hit home. The data's there. We've seen the data. When we had our A through G special board meeting last year, we are shown numbers that over 54% of LC Allen students were not on path to graduate. So when we get this data 4 or 5 months later, and it's showing that only 5% are utilizing a waiver for math, that's a big flag. That's a big concern. Are they getting the information? Are the students that need these waivers getting the information on the process accurately and timely enough to be a part of this process? So we should have answered those questions, because it's something that we saw the writing on the wall already. It scared all of us, and we want to make sure this is being done properly. I'm a huge champion of this avenue, because what this does is provides off-ramps for students and families to see their own version of success through high school, to know there are other opportunities to successfully get through high school and begin their paths. And family engagement is a huge part of that. So as we're going through this process and preparing this, understanding what those different levels of family engagement need to look like and how to be compliant, and getting that feedback from those families of what's important to them and why they're requesting these waivers and why this matters, so that we have those opportunities to learn from this and help others in the future.
Any other board comments? Seeing none, would anybody oppose another public comment? No? Okay, Chris Birch? You have 3 minutes.
Got a lot to say in 3 minutes. A lot of them are pertaining to your questions. I am a school counselor at Santa Rosa High School, and I was on this graduation committee, and I'm also was on the alt ed committee. So I did a lot of work with my team members, as well as the district office people as well. So those questions that you have, I actually have answers to, and if you want me to go sit down there and answer them, I can, or I can answer them from here. So the first thing I wanted to address is just in regards to communication with families. So previous, and I want to thank Emmanuel for all the work he's done with data, because as you may or may not know, our previous data collection system didn't work. And there was no differentiation. There was no way you could pool the differences between different waivers compared to exemptions, compared to all of these other intricate pieces that nobody except for us in the trenches ever knows, because of course he's a school counselor. So, we're not just talking about this graduation waiver that we're specifically talking about, the third year math. We also have ethnic studies waivers. We also have any students with IEPs get their 130 minimum California graduation requirements. We also have the ABs that are for homeless and migrant families. There is so many moving parts for a counselor to try to grab a hold of, and so many pieces of paper that we have to grab a hold of to make sure we communicate, to make sure we get signatures, then to make sure that the registrar gets it and the vice principal gets it. And then Emmanuel is talking to our registrars to make sure there's a new code created for that specific kid, the kid who had Spanish in middle school, but then needs 1 year in high school, or the kid who takes the JC Spanish 1, which is only 13 credits instead of 20 credits, but yet counts for 2 years. There's so many intricacies that we have to follow to try to get these kids to fit into this box. So many pieces of paper, so much data inputting. And again, if it wasn't for Emmanuel, we, including the board, would have no data to be able to figure out and get these kids at least in a box that makes sense that we can look at and say, grad requirements are pretty darn close to being accurate. So thank you for that, Manuel. The next thing is in regards to how we communicate with families and families of both Spanish and English-speaking families. As high school counselors, we do a ton of outreach. We have parent nights, we have question and answer nights, we go to middle schools, we have ELAC, we have one of our counselors, we have two of our counselors who speak Spanish that hold parent nights for all questions to do with school, not just waivers, but how do you contact the attendance office? How do you check your kid out? How do you log in and get a parent login to be able to follow your child? What not to, when your kid says, oh, no, I was in that class, I swear, Mom.
Thank you,
How
Chris.
to not, not
Here's the 3
necessarily
minutes are up.
trust. Yeah, so how
Thank
do you
you.
second, how do you guess, how do you do that? So we work very closely with our parents, no matter what their language is, of trying to educate them. We also work very closely.
Thank you, Chris. Your 3 minutes are up. Thank you.
I'm asking, do you not want the answers to your questions then? I know why LC Allen numbers are different. Does anyone care?
I'm just trying to be fair in terms of public comment period, but I appreciate it. Really do. Thank you. Anything final, board? Manuel, thank you for the data.
I'd like to follow up.
Go ahead.
Chris, I just like to follow up. That information is really important, right? And then we're just trying to be fair in terms of the Brown Act, in terms of people having all this. But I'll be more than willing to sit down with you and talk about that and relate the information to the board. Because I think it's important for us to know what's going on in terms of the disparity in the numbers. So it's not that we don't want to hear you. We do. We just want to be fair in terms of the meeting rules. I'll follow up with you and give you a call and make sure that we have that information.
Thank you. Thank you all for the presentation. Appreciate it. We will now move on to our next board item. It's another discussion item. It is discussion on alternative education recommendations and updates. Item D2.
Thank you. This presentation is a result of a lot of hard work from the Alt Ed Committee. Again, thank you to all the members on that committee, the good and difficult thinking from the teachers, the counselors, and all the individuals that participated. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Executive Director Tim Zolinardo and our coordinator, Aaron Gildengoran.
Good evening, Superintendent Trunell, President Medina, members of the board. Give me just a sec to click on my presentation and share the screen. Thank you for your patience with that. And good evening once again, also to our Santa Rosa City Schools community. So in just a minute, I'm going to turn over the bulk of the information to Mr. Gildengoran as our alternative education coordinator. But I did want to set the stage just a minute. So as you saw in the board cover and as the public could see, we met multiple times between the creation of the committee and tonight's date. In that, there was a commitment on the part of Mr. Gildengoran and for myself to make sure that we were true committee chairs in the sense that we were facilitators, but not that we were coming forward and asking members to comply with a version of things that we think they should be. We really wanted the committee to be able to think broadly and widely and co-construct ideas for alternative education as a group. The beautiful thing was that most of the people who consistently showed up, those folks all have a lot of experience or have had experience in alternative education settings. So there's a lot of qualitative knowledge from the lived experience of the members. Lastly, talking about coming forward with specific expectations, there was only one hidden agenda that was a completely transparent agenda, which was that we did not want to talk about alternative education settings in the form of kind of a deficit mindset. I want to make sure that's absolutely clear. And a few months ago, I was in front of this board and I defined alternative education as a very broad array of options within a public school institution that allows students to find paths towards success. So I want to make sure I make that very clear. We began as a committee by reminding ourselves of all the different iterations and nuances with the ways in which alternative education can emerge and the kind of situations and the ways in which it supports students. So as I turn it over, that is how we ask the committee to engage in the work. We ask them to think of the fact of your niece, your son or daughter, your cousin, a young person you know, the ways in which comprehensive education tries to meet their needs, but maybe there are some other things that they could use to support them. And we ask the group to think from a place of support and to think of alternative education from a growth mindset. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Gildengorn.
Superintendent Trinnell, Board President Medina, trustees, thank you for having us and providing us the time. I'm not going to read word for word the slides that, hopefully you've all had a chance to preview, but I'll highlight a few things about each priority and save the bulk of our time for questions and discussion. The presentation is in reverse order. So priority 5 was deemed by the group as the lowest priority of the models that that were created that they wanted to prioritize, and that is a grades 7 through 12 CTE magnet programs. Some important factors would be developing partnerships between middle schools and high schools and cohorting CTE programs. The example given was a science medical careers at CCLA, which would feed into a health science pathway at Elsie Allen High School. The important things to remember with CTE is that it creates interest-based choices and student agency with choosing their education. This model would be building on already existing CTE pathways. With each model, there is approximate cost on a slide, and I want to highlight that it is approximate. Depending on how each one of these priorities would be rolled out, there is a great variation in the cost that it could entail for our district. This one, for example, there's a broad range of over about $5 million. Another important consideration is having CTE awareness and exploration activities at all of these grade levels, so students are exposed to not just the different programs within the school, but different career and technical education options as they become adults.
And before we dig into priority 4, just quick reminders with approximate costs. It could be from developing things in current locations, and we'll talk about more of that later, but physical locations, as you see the approximate costs that already exist but need to be transformed a little bit, all the way to creating new locations. So that's why you're going to see a pretty broad range. And lastly, do remember that the committee members worked in groups to build these different models, and then we did at the end kind of rank them through a consensus model. So when you see them in the way that we're presenting them, the group as a whole kind of worked in subgroups, and then we brought everything together as a whole, and then the whole kind of made judgments about ranking which model should be the top priority. And we are starting again from what the group agreed was the 5th most pressing. We'll end with the 1st most pressing. So we are kind of going in reverse order.
Priority 4 is a model similar to big picture learning. Big picture learning model is typically 3 days a week, about 8:30 to 1 o'clock, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You're doing instruction in classrooms with teachers. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that time is typically reserved for community service projects, internships, internship experiences, field trips. And so students are gaining credits through work experience. And then within the cost of the model, I was able to get an approximate quote for Big Picture Learning. It starts around $35,000 to be a part of their network, and then grows according to the amount of support. You can have a Big Picture Learning model. You can model that type of school and that type of curriculum without necessarily being a part of that company's network. So that's something that should be in consideration for whether or not we were going to align with that company. And it's a smaller student-to-teacher ratio, approximately 20-1, a much smaller counselor-to-student ratio as well. And again, is really driven by work experience, internships, and community building. Priority 3 is
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
You know, I know we have some experience with project-based learning from Learning House during the pandemic. Can you kind of talk a little bit about the ways in which this model is kind of grounded in what we learned during Learning House, or is it reflective at all? Is there anything that we can take away from Learning House to apply here? Right.
I won't be able to speak about the specifics, but I know that the pedagogy, the instructional pedagogy behind Learning House is around differentiation and combined grades and high expectations and rigor and a belief going into that the students will be able to succeed in a project-based learning environment. But you want to speak to the specifics of that particular model? Because they were blended grades, weren't they? Or?
Yeah, and I would say that the lessons that can be learned may not be, I don't know, simply transferred once people kind of look at scope and what we're talking about. We do have, once again, grade ranges here, but they may not be explicitly kind of co-equal to other settings in terms of what they served. And with project-based learning specifically, I know the educators that were working in that environment, you know, had a strong grasp of what they were trying to do, but this would, to me, be a little bit larger scale, and it would require a deeper commitment across probably ed services to support.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Add here too, because we did take a trip up to the foothills to visit a Big Picture Learning school. Confluence High School, thank you. I was trying not to name them, but Confluence High School, where we had an opportunity to see a Big Picture Learning continuation high school in action. In this case, it was a continuation high school. And the difference here is the one age difference. We had a lot of, in Learning House, a lot of elementary students as well. And so there's a difference. I want to address the differences in times. If you could go back to that slide on what the schedule says. So we asked the question of, well, what happens on the off days? You still have teachers, so what's happening with them? And the answer was some kids may not have acquired an internship yet. So they might actually still be at school working with teachers, working on curriculum content and intervention as they're still trying to acquire an internship, because it has to be a good fit. It's as if they're applying for a job per se, and it depends on their area of interest and whether an internship actually exists in that moment, or if they have to work with employers to build an opportunity. So it really is really tailored to individual students and what their future interests are, so they can get into the field and experience what it's like.
Can I just add also that there are two types of Big Picture Learning schools, right? You have the continuation school type, and then you have the magnet sort of school one, right? That it could be A through G, it could be, you know, it's independent, you know, high school. For the most part, you know, a lot of the ones that we visited were, you know, well, I actually visited one in Sacramento that was, you know, 9 through 12. It was A through G approved, you know, and they had their own, you know, their graduation requirements, and they started 9th grade with, you know, with the idea of, you know, this is a community where you learn how to, you know, be part of the community by actually being part of the community and going out there. So that's one. And two, we've had these, well, not only here in Santa Rosa, but across, Sonoma County, we had a disparity in terms of, what do we teach our students who normally said, our traditional high school hasn't worked for me, right? And then we put them in another place where we give them packets, right, of the same sort of things that, didn't work for them, right? And this is a different, type of schooling in terms of, okay, this is more hands-on, you get experience, you get credits by doing your internship. So it's a different type of approach, right? Something that I've been actually pushing forward, for, our continuation high school here to do. But it could go either way, right? In terms of continuation high school or comprehensive high school.
So to continue, priority 3, the middle priority is high school on-site intervention programs. Similar to the GRACE model that currently exists that was a part of the presentation on, I believe, January 10th. Different in that this model would be more specifically for 9th through 11th graders to support them in when they're identified as struggling and offering things for students who do not wish to continue with their education to be enrolled in or to have concurrent enrollment options to be prepared for the HiSET or the GED. As well as possibly letting those students enroll, 11th grade students enroll at Ridgeway High School if they would like access to a 180 credit diploma. And then the cost with this, it can vary greatly because there may be a site that would need to hire 4 teachers to make this happen specifically. When this model was developed, the group that developed it had the intent of hiring 4 new teachers and having a different schedule or basing the schedule for those teachers, those core subject teachers, for these students so that those teachers can have collaboration time later in the day. So, to follow the exact model, this would be a more accurate cost, but at a school where you could isolate sections and take current teachers that you have, you may not need to hire as many teachers, or you reallocate responsibilities for counselors and classified personnel that are currently there, and then it doesn't cost as much to recreate programs similar to GRACE or similar to the model that's being presented here. Priority 2, which I would like to point out was very close in voting with priority 3. They were nearly tied, is for a middle school opportunity program. Important aspects of this is that it would be at a separate site. Not necessarily a brand new building, but not at a current middle school site was kind of key for the group that modeled this, to give those students a new environment and kind of that fresh start. As well as having, increased parent involvement. And then transportation would be a major consideration if this wasn't going to be at a current site, moving students from all around the district. And the model is approximately 80 to 100, I believe. There's transportation costs to also be considered within this. And then the highest priority was the expansion of our independent study program. This group modeled 4 different possible expansions to independent study, starting with simply hiring more independent study teachers to expand our current model to serve more students and eliminate the need for a wait list, to expanding our ISP model and having a fully virtual independent study program for students where they don't have that weekly 1 hour mandatory session with a teacher.
Sorry, where they don't have that mandatory session?
So in a fully virtual independent study model, there is a teacher who is responsible for a much larger caseload, and they would have similar to open office hours for groups of students virtually, or that this is a model that could be used. And so they would be responsible for like checking on students' work and communicating with them if they're falling behind in particular subjects. But in our current model, there is a mandatory 1 hour per week with the teacher to stay up to date and be checked in with, receive additional help. But in a virtual model, it's not mandatory. Students are essentially taking courses through online avenues, and it's being supervised by a teacher, and then there are more of an open office hours group meetings.
Do you mean like Ingenuity play? I mean, is it Cyber High, that sort of thing?
Our current online courses are Cyber High and Acellus.
Excel, okay.
Can I just add here, can you go back to the 50 versus the 25? The difference here that we just want the board to be aware of, and we did share this with our team before presenting, is the law still says that we will only get ADA reimbursement for 25 per teacher. So if a teacher is serving 50, we will only get ADA reimbursement for 25.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the priority determination? How did you determine what's highest priority, what's, you know?
So the group consensus was that the highest priority, the number one priority that should be considered by the board would be this independent study. And then the lowest priority model would be the one that we started with, which was the further development of CTE magnet programs.
I get that, but I mean, what are the motivators behind that? Like, why?
It's a wide range of discussion we had. We tried to take into account a lot of the knowledge of the individuals on the committee, what they're seeing explicitly in schools with students that they're interacting with. We also took into consideration the collective knowledge of the group around kind of what's really practical, like right now. Those members of the committee are well-informed individuals. They understand our budgetary environment. So some things might come from a very practical lens. And then lastly, it was really kind of conversation about, we always try, well, we started President Medina with kind of like a list of things that should really guide our work. What provides the most flexibility? What allows student agency? What gives students the ability to like explore non-traditional experiences in school? And so those kind of things were at the kind of base of our, like the themes that overran how we kind of approached it. And I think those did emerge in shifting how people kind of made final decisions. So it's a mixture of different things in a really nuanced way that we discussed over multiple weeks.
Questions, board members? Trustee McNally?
Is it okay if we go through the important notations?
Oh my gosh, I thought you were at the end, sorry.
It's okay, and then we're going to go into questions, and then we'll kind of be done. So we'll just kind of go into important notations, and I'll pass it back to Mr. Gildengorn.
So some of these we discussed, but important notations for priority 5. Those that developed this included that high school students would have flexibility to access CTE programs across the district. So they foresaw students being able to be at their home school for core subjects and then take transportation in some way or another to a desired CTE program. If there was a focus, for instance, at Santa Rosa High, there was a culinary program to be able to give students that choice. For that detail to come into realization, transportation, attendance, accountability issues for students, safety issues come into play. However, if students wanted to be able to transfer, if that was something that we wanted to be made a priority by our superintendent and board, we could change the way or increase the availability of intra-district transfers. For priority 3, the high school onsite intervention program was developed with the idea for a different schedule for those classes that, as I touched on, and the creation of a separate schedule may be a roadblock to that model being followed exactly, but it also may not be imperative to having further high school onsite programs similar to Grace. Priority 2 and priority 3 were close in the voting. Priority 2, the 7th and 8th grade opportunity program model, was developed with the idea to bring back the ARPC to the district, to have both voluntary and involuntary placement of students within that program. And the ARPC was previously disbanded due to state-identified issues of inequity with regards to students who were being identified and involuntarily transferred. So we felt it was important to note that. Priority 1, due to ADA laws, virtual ISP model ratios would have to be further explored and ensured to ensure the student-teacher ratio is compliant, as Superintendent Trinnell pointed out. Our student board member who's not here tonight, I call that person out because they specifically asked about reintegration with alternative ed models. Reintegration was cited in all the models as a need, and it's a policy that would have to be developed for any new program moving forward. All models would have the capacity to support students with 504s and IEPs, though each model would likely be best suited to serve mild to moderate needs, not moderate to severe. And then these priorities were set using a consensus model with the group. So, you know, not everyone agreed to which model is the first priority, but through group vote, there was the consensus as to the priorities set as the way that they are, and the agreement to support one another in doing so.
And thank you for your patience. We're almost done. There are some questions that we have to end the presentation, and as those kind of are up there and you have a chance to start ruminating on them again, I just wanted to mention 2 key things that are also important to note. One of those is that we talked about elementary schools early on and intervention and alternative education settings. We started to talk a lot about the Community Schools Partnership Program, and we realized that that might be its own endeavor. Of course, that's incurring in our district, and so we did kind of like move that off to the side. Our focus then really became 7 through 12, and to be really fair to our committee, we said our job is to facilitate them when we were with them, and with the board, our job is to present the information clearly that they came up with. We know that not everything here is figured out. That's definitely the case. We know the committee would have to come back with direction to get more detail. So you might ask some questions that our answer will be, well, we need more time to develop that. But I can say very clearly, there was a lot of concern about the window in between 7 through 9, 10, came up quite a bit. And Mr. Gilligan and I were going over some notes when we got here during the city council meeting, just reminding ourselves of some of the information we used with the group. And part of that, which we're happy to speak to if you want more information, was just information from our students who are currently in alternative settings and from parents and what they were looking for. And that age group also came up as an area of concern, a place where extra help could have really been used to help students make sure they maintain a positive path. So those are just important other things to consider. And now that you've had time to ruminate on some of the questions that we kind of ask you, we turn it over to you at this point. And thank you for your patience with the presentation.
Thank you. So I have Trustee McNally, followed by Trustee De La Torre, Trustee Flores, Trustee De La Cruz.
Thank you for the presentation. Do we have any current spaces that would be viable for the opportunity program without any major disruption to our existing schools?
This is a place where I'll put on my faux facilities hat, but I don't really want to pretend to speak too clearly to those. So what I would say is we do have obviously trends of enrollment and space. We've done that just most recently for the bond. So we can tell you those things in more specifics. I can't rattle them off right now. And those could be places to look at smaller incremental moves where you're knocking down walls, renovating a space for use. So we'd have to bring that information back up to consider that. So there are spaces currently.
I think also we can defer to Associate Superintendent Ms. August.
Thank you. Perfect. Tim, you
Please
can have
just
your
stay
spot
there, it's
back and
fine.
all. Thank you for the question. And there are several factors related to that. So as Director Zalinardo shared that yes, with our capacity analysis through our facilities master plan, there are sites that have some additional spaces available. However, with the contract that the board approved last week for the school closure and consolidation committee facilitation, that's something that could be explored for the long term over the next couple of years as we go through that process and recommendations are made on how to best use our facilities across the district.
Was that it, Trustee McDonald? Trustee La Torre?
Thank you very much for your presentation. So this has been brought up before. In a perfect world, we wouldn't need these opportunities and these programs. But in the real world, we do. And I really appreciate the time and effort that went into identifying the different needs and what were considered priorities. All these programs are going to have a cost. All these programs are going to need staffing. So I'd like some food for thought planted that we are considering what opportunities may allow us to retain or rehire staff that we recently had to notice. How can we utilize what we have? How can we use what we have to make any of this work? I do have some concerns with priority one being virtual. As a parent of a student with an IEP, distance learning and virtual learning was a complete nightmare. And I know it says that there will be some options available, but nothing in the IEP translated, none of the resources. So we have students that are very vulnerable and are in a situation where they need alternative education opportunities. And it's really hard to put a student in front of a laptop at home or in an environment and say, here's the other opportunity because what's normal wasn't working. So trying to take that in consideration as well. These are really vulnerable students that we don't want to lose, and we want to provide opportunities to help educate and retain and reignite that spark of how important education is and can be. So we just need to keep thinking about those priorities and how these things might land. Investments have to be made, so let's make them as smartly as possible to really get to the students.
Can I add, for trustees' consideration, if we're thinking about doing something more immediate, what we have to take a look at is how many students that we would be bringing into a separate program. And then we do an equivalency of the FTE that we currently have. Because math would be if we remove, say, 50 kids from the general program, or the number that would be part of our class size, we would equate that to the number of FTE. The tricky part is the kind of program that we want to offer. Unless we're trying to use multiple subject teachers where there is housing going on about the kind of subjects that they're teaching, we need to think about the number of teachers to the equivalent of the number of courses that students need to take. That's where the math gets a little bit tricky, because if we're going to offer them a 7-period day experience, just throwing out a number, we need to have a number of teachers with that number of credentials or who have a combination thereof credentials to be able to teach all of those subjects. Obviously, we want to be innovative. We want to capture the interest of students in order to retain them. And we need to think outside the box as far as what that coursework looks like in order to get them back into reintegration eventually. And so that's going to take extra effort.
Was that it, Trustee La Torre? Trustee Flores?
I have several questions here, so bear with me. So first, let me go back to, let's see, priority number 2, middle school priority program. So we've already identified that we have a need based on our waivers, right, for LOTE and math, right? So I was looking at priority number 2, and I didn't see, scaffolding opportunities to ensure that students who are struggling in math or LOTE are given the opportunity to do that, in a way, before they struggle in high school. Just food for thought, okay? That's something we can add in the future to see, as an alternative sort of education before they start struggling once they enter high school. Now, 2, priority number 1, I understand why, people that elect independent studies, right? So what's the number of, waitlist students that we have wanting to go into independent studies?
Thank you for the question. Currently, the wait list, currently Independent Studies serves 125 students with 5 teachers. And the wait list is approximately 40 students. It fluctuates with students coming on and off and students graduating early. We had a few graduates at the quarter, so some students came off of the wait list. So around 40 currently.
Okay, so that's what I thought. So, the idea, the way I was thinking about this is that, what sort of programs do we have in order to attract and help those students that are not, that are falling through the cracks, right? A different sort of method to ensure that we are we're capturing before they start, failing or, they drop out or whatnot, right? So, maybe, I'm thinking for priority 1, we need to expand that a little bit, right? Not developed, a full-on, just one sort of thing in here. And priority number 2, we need to ensure that we develop scaffolding opportunities for students who are struggling in LOTE and math. And then, but the idea, is to further, it's further in alternative education options. Then, and I want to start thinking about programs that will attract those different types of learners, those learners that eventually, end up not fulfilling their graduation requirements for whatever reason, right? Or end up at, Ridgeway. So that's the idea that I'm thinking in terms of alternative education. I think priority 1 is phenomenal, right? I think we need to expand it a little bit, right? But in terms of thinking outside the box, we need to start looking at priority, number 5, 4, 3, and 2 as new innovative ways to ensure that we, encapsulate those students who are not, doing well in traditional schooling. Thank you.
Trustee De La Cruz.
Thank you for the exciting thinking here. I know it's been quick, and so I'm grateful for the urgency that I see reflected in these steps forward. I'm wondering if there is a list of criteria that you used to both come up with these areas of focus and then that you used to prioritize the presentation here today?
Yeah, so I'll just speak kind of to, once again, when the committee first met, we really kind of started with an experience of talking about, let me go back a step. A lot of the members of the committee, I think almost everyone who was showing up consistently had already worked in alternative settings. And so one of the first questions was, what about that experience from your point of view really made that a different environment that worked for students? So there's a lot of discussion about that. And from that, we drew some common themes, as I referred to earlier, that had a lot to do with what we think were valuable in terms of, we saw students need a lot of flexibility. We saw students need a lot of agency returned to them because they can get disenfranchised through their educational experience. And like I alluded to, we also use the criteria of what are teachers and counselors and administrators seeing now. And like I said as well, we also use feedback from parents and families and students who are actually currently in some of our alternative settings. And one of the resounding things that came up as a really important criteria was smaller environments. Getting more individual attention just kind of sang out from the rooftops as just really being key. So you can see all these models include a reference to smaller, which then has references back to concerns about costs and staffing and FTE. we know that, but our job was to bring forward what came from the committee, and that came out very clearly. So that was a significant one. And then also is just very clearly discussing, once again, that range. A lot of parents and students and our own staff are able to acknowledge that if we could make sure that we had a smaller environment that really focused on community and kind of well-being and connectedness, so it's smaller, so maybe it's easy to connect in there, and that's accentuated. And you also provided intensive individual support with a little bit more academic intervention. That would be really key. And so those two things came up as being really key and important. Other than that, I've kind of covered the broad range of things that influence the development of the models. And because you had a core group of 12 or 13 to 15 people really coming together, working in subgroups of 2 or 3, the voting was very close by the nature of just the size of the group.
I really appreciate that. So oh, go ahead.
I would just like to, to add, Trustee De La Cruz, we also, as a part of the work that we did, we looked at the overarching definitions of 8 different types of alternative schools, from diploma press programs to community schools, magnet programs, and schools and charters, opportunity education, and then also looked at about 17 local to California programs from a variety of different models to inspire and to educate, because some of the language around community school, community day school, and county community school, right? It sounds very similar, but they are very different programs. So we did that as well.
So given that this is kind of your area of, or this criteria that you're using to prioritize and kind of make these choices, how does expansion of an ISP program kind of meet those criteria? Because that's the one that really feels like it's individual, online, right? And it's not creating that connectedness or that sense of community or the cohort. So that's the one that feels like a little bit of an outlier, but I'd love to hear how that came to be the highest priority.
Yeah, I don't want to speak exactly for all the experiences of ISP teachers, et cetera, and their knowledge, but when you go back to some of those things about individual kind of attention and help, when you go back to kind of the sense of being known and belonging, though a student in an independent study environment is not immersed in like that full school experience with all the different pieces that go along with that, there is 2 key parts of that process that emerge. One, oftentimes the student is looking for something explicitly that they are not receiving in that larger mass, that individual kind of sense of connection with the teacher and their ability to focus in a more kind of self-initiated environment really seems to help. And so students tell that to our teachers. So that really goes with the kind of one-to-one help, flexibility, the ability to really connect with the student, but not in the way you're thinking. It's not like through, let's say, full school environment activities. And the second thing that comes is the range of human experience, right, and cognition is so broad. That's why we all have to have a growth mindset, is just so complex to capture in how schools function. And so what happens is you have students that just desire for a multitude of reasons. And when you ask an independent study teacher, what is this student's individual story that makes this the setting for them? It's completely different than student B. It really is, each individual story is that unique and complex. So that's why it came up as being to the group, a system that is responsive. And I did add earlier that there were practicalities as we were talking, and we knew that that is something that could scale up much quicker than maybe, let's say, something that requires CTE materials and facilities and, saws brought in or whatever. So that's part of it.
Thank you.
May I add? The other piece about independent study, just in my years of experience in secondary education, is that not all students who are in independent study are struggling. They're child actors, they're professional athletes that travel, and they need a different kind of environment for their learning in order to support really what their passion is and their future trajectory. So it's not always that the students are struggling. It really is a matter of what they need so that they can expand their own opportunities.
An ISP track is what got me through law school in my 3rd year, right? And it was really about creating the kind of education that I wanted that I wasn't getting. right? And then being able to really choose the teachers that I wanted to work with to develop that curriculum that wasn't being offered. So I just really appreciate kind of some of the, demystifying of what our ISP model looks like, and really recognizing that individualization that can create that deeper sense of connectedness. Let's see. I really appreciate the acknowledgement that some of these older models, right, around alternative placements were disbanded for reasons of, concerns about racism. Can you talk about what protections, what kind of skills, what checks and balances will be put into place to make sure that we are not going back to something that we know hurts kids of color?
So through our work, we essentially have deemed all of these models as voluntary. So recruitment for them would vary depending on the program. So the CTE Magnet programs is something that would be publicized and students would be recruited for on a very broad spectrum. Something like a middle school opportunity program, there would need to be a process developed within ARs and board policies on how to identify kids, how to inform families, and how to go through that process to ensure those things don't happen.
How did you get to 80 to 100 already?
That was a matter of trying to give a specificity so it wasn't too amorphous that we thought was at least a feasible starting place. And in thinking about talking about student bodies and just the need that we're being seen, especially by our middle school teachers, we're trying to think of kind of just a number that felt like it was reasonable. And also, once again, keeping in mind one of those guiding lights of kind of environments that weren't too overwhelming for students. And maybe these are places that students are struggling because of anxiety or maybe the social conditions or having a trouble navigating how to, their maturation level or their understanding of how to navigate this is complex for them. And we thought, that would be a place to begin. So we tried to start with what we thought would be a feasible beginning based on kind of what the collective knowledge was of the need in the room and thinking through our MTSS 1, 2, and 3 tiers, what kind of the number of students that we might see kind of bubbling up who could be really talked to and discussed with. And as Mr. Gildingorn said, all of these would be options of choice. And as I said at the beginning, we don't have all the answers to everything yet. So that is something the committee, we told them there may very well be direction that we are going to return with you with, and that we need to work out some more specific details, which might be, what are the triggering criteria and conditions? How do we communicate that, et cetera?
Yeah, I'm really grateful that, there is some real recognition of historical recognition of certain problems being problematic. And then so I'm really excited to, dig in with this board to make sure that we learn from those past mistakes and we don't recreate those problems. I think I also just want to lift up, right, voluntary nature of certain, enrollment can be a really ephemeral reality for parents and kids who are struggling inside of our systems. We see this definitely with school discipline conversations. You have a choice between this and this, but, right, and so we see folks doing that because there isn't the level of, to Trustee Sheffield's point earlier around cultural responsive communication, parents and kids really feeling empowered in these conversations. So just, I'm excited for this board to continue providing guidance around, what does it look like to put, protective bubbles around our choices to really help us kind of bounce into a place that is new, right? And it's intentionally new with a lot of the lessons that we've learned from past harm.
Can I just add the note about that? That's why we've been so consistent about that range of cost. It's a 50-50 response from students and parents of students who are currently in our alternative settings, who said basically, I would love to have some kind of alternative setting embedded within because I don't want to be removed. And also we have those saying, I would like to actually maybe have a chance to start somewhere different because I would like to remove myself. And so that gets to other layered complications about how others see themselves within a community and an environment and what sustains them and lifts them up. So it's very nuanced and complicated. I do think there'd have to be an elaborate discussion about that within the committee and then maybe some direction.
And to that point, I was wondering if there was any kind of like data collected or analyzed, qualitative or quantitative, from kids and parents who are currently in alternative placements. You know, again, in discipline conversations that this board has had, you know, around certain choices that students have made, those are definitely the questions that we ask, you know, students and families and admin in the discipline conversation, right? Which is, why is this the best choice for this kid? And how can we make sure that this is true empowerment in making this choice, right? And so I'm curious about what kind of data it was collected, if at all, and is that available for us to look at and understand, you know, as we also are guided in making policy here?
Yes, so we did two different surveys. The group was first asked by Mr. Zelenardo before I joined the district to go out and collect street data and conduct empathy interviews with students. And that was done in a variety of ways. Some folks had one-on-one conversations with students and sometimes families to fill out the form and get qualitative data. Other folks gave the survey to students in a broader swath. And so students took it individually. And then when I came on, I was able to sit down with students from Grace and from Ridgeway and hold kind of group interviews with those students. So we had over 100 student responses. And then we also sent out a survey to parents of students in the Grace program, parents of students at Ridgeway, ISP, and home and hospital. Unfortunately, we only received 8 responses to those, but that data was shared with the group and was looked at. And I believe that we could share those responses with you.
Right. I know we've got a lot of new offerings at Santa Rosa High School, night school, you know, some of these kind of ESL programs for parents. Those also seem like there would be rich areas for us to talk about some of those alternative, and not only alternative models for, you know, for kids who are looking for some additional supports, but also like a captive audience is not the phrase I want to use, but like a great place to engage with parents who might be in one room all together for us to talk with. Has there been any fiscal analysis at the admin level to determine which of these are even possible?
So at this point, no, we did have the discussion the other day when we were looking through the slides as far as the ranges. And so we looked at, okay, are these reasonable costs? And from that level, yes. But as far as the feasibility, no, because as you all know, we're in a situation where we have to now prioritize which services and programs we are going to pursue. And if something new comes in, something that we have existing needs to go out. And so that's the space that we're in, is looking for direction on prioritization.
And to that end too, are we looking at grant programs that are looking at alternative settings to deal with kind of social emotional behavior challenges that are definitely not ours alone in this time in our country? Is there any kind of digging deep into those, whether it's a federal earmark or, right, is there ways in which we could really activate and engage in some advocacy at a state and federal level with and for you?
Always on that piece of it. We're always looking for opportunities to augment any funding that we do have. I am not aware of any specific grants related to this, aside from looking at services through the community schools partnership program. And really that's partnering with organizations to be able to provide wraparound services, which does speak to the social, emotional, and things of that nature, and the familial supports.
Thank you so much.
I think following up on that, I was priority 5. It lists, the LC Allen Health Science Pathway. They've got the education, the public safety, the mechanical engineering. Those are programs that exist. I imagine they're already staffed. And here it doesn't, in terms of the cost, it doesn't list teachers, counselors, et cetera. So are these just construction costs. It talks about labs and remodels.
So the, the cost, those numbers include, costs for four new middle school CTE labs, and then four remodeled rooms. So that first number, the 3.65 million, would be for those new lab programs, which are wheel programs. So every middle school that has that would get an opportunity to go through a wheel of programming of CTE, as well as the four remodeled rooms. And then the higher end of that is would be multiple high school remodels and equipment purchases, and it is completely conjecture. It is not. I mean, we took real costs. We worked with a coordinator of CTE programs and got prices from her on what the wheel program or CTE labs cost, as well as other projects that she has already executed. But we're not able, at this point, we weren't able to give that much attention to detail and exactly what would be purchased and who would need to be hired and the exact remodel costs. It really is approximate.
If I can add to that, that is something that would be an allowable use within the bonds through our facilities master planning. It would need to be evaluated when we're looking at our prioritization and the modernization of each of those school sites. So it's something that could be incorporated once we get to that actual project evaluation at sites. It is a lengthy process to, obviously, depending on where we go with that, because it would be obviously all DSA if we're doing an actual remodel of something. If we're replacing like for like, as far as doing some type of upgrade, then that's a lower cost.
Okay, so that's kind of what I was getting at, if those were just something that could be done with those funds. And you probably, I don't think you know this, but I was wondering if the 3.6 million versus 8.5 were the estimates based on the 3.6 being only the four middle schools and the 8.5 being only the high schools, or would the 8.5 be the middle schools plus the high schools?
The 8.5 was the middle schools plus high schools.
Okay. Trustee La Torre?
So the ultimate driving force on this should be the students and student needs. Have this committee or have we put in any steps into understanding what our current student needs are for alternative education and what of these priorities might fit those specific student needs?
Yes. So within our student survey, we asked what needs they felt needed to be addressed. Students highlighted needing additional academic support, wanting more one-to-one conversations with counselors and teachers, wanting more community building and connection, and wanting a smaller school environment, as well as wanting smaller class environments. So the students that are in our alternative ed programs currently, that was the feedback that they gave as to what they felt was positive about their experience, what they thought they would have needed when they first needed an alternative setting outside of a comprehensive site, and what they thought others would need as well.
Yeah, and I just want to, oh, go ahead.
That's very similar to what I've heard as well with students. And unfortunately, a lot of those don't hit the nail on the head when it comes to virtual learning. So that's why I just wanted to, obviously you guys are doing the work and I really appreciate that, but I want to make sure we're asking those questions because a lot of those connections is what's really being needed and desired by the students in need. And virtual is a top priority and that might make the most sense, but it's going to be hard to make that work.
I think given the answer on the possible use of funds, my question that comes up now is rough guesstimates on timeline for implementation of these different models. Like, seems like priority 5 one would take years versus, well, I don't know what they would take, how long it would take. Do you guys have any idea?
Well,
Assuming we had resources, how long would they take to implement?
I mean, it could take, with planning on the quickest end, in my opinion, would be the independent study, which could happen as soon as this fall. I think the places where we have to build space and infrastructure and consider the programming, that could take a little bit longer, up to at least the next half a year for a potential soft start in the spring or a pilot of some kind. And I just want to offer this because I feel that, I mean, for us, we would love to do all of this because it means multiple opportunities, that we're modeling that a one-size-fits-all is not what we're after, right? Unfortunately, funding is a constraint. Just us poring over data over this last year and the equity and anti-racism work that we're doing, where we're looking directly at students, I feel that there's two areas that could be a start for us. And I'm just going to put this out there to the board, and ultimately it will be your direction. I think we should look at independent study. We do a lot more of our alternative program thinking in our secondary education years. In high school, I think there's something that we need to focus on in middle school. What we notice is that because we have 8 feeder elementary districts, which is why we're getting out there to meet with our feeder districts to understand what programming looks like, so we can bring bridges for our kids and for their experience. We're also losing kids. That's the first place, because our students converge together in 7th grade, that by 8th grade, we're already losing kids. We know this, it is verified in our data. When we look at interventions, when we look at counseling opportunities, interventions, where students are starting to drop off, you can see it in patterns. So we have to do something in middle school. And I would recommend that we design a pilot that we can start as a start. There are going to be costs involved. Will we be able to start that in August? No. But could we soft start something where we're engaging parents, identifying the kids, starting to meet with them and understand their needs? That is absolute. I think we can do that. I think that is doable. So I'm just going to seed plant those two things.
I'm sorry, but a pilot in terms of what, though? What sort of programs are we looking for?
The grade 7-8 opportunity model is what I'm hearing.
Yes, so I think that's what we would have to identify.
So I want to just ground us that this, I raised the alternative ed, this conversation, in the face of increasing school safety issues that were being raised by our community and being experienced by our kids. So if we're really grounded in kind of recognizing that ISP is awesome, creates a lot of flexibility, right? But it doesn't necessarily kind of get at that core rationale that created the basis for this conversation in the first place. I don't know if that, for me, hits the highest mark. I also am not willing to entertain any program that lets us lose ADA dollars at this stage in where we are as a district. And so for me, that also kind of takes option 1, kicks it a little bit lower down on the priority for me. So if you're looking for direction from this board as a whole, I would love for us to be able to have some discussion between all of us so that we can reach consensus on what is the highest priority for us that's really grounded, in that purpose for this conversation in the first place. And, that really allows us to focus limited resources, limited staff, and, in a tough way. So, and I just grateful for your recommendation that, in terms of what is possible to roll out and start developing, to me, it really does feel like the 7-8 opportunity model, opportunity program, seems to hit, for me at least, again, the genesis for really wanting to have this conversation was about school safety and looking for alternative placements, responding to both teachers as well as kids asking for some of those things that look different from where we are right now. So I just, can we take a straw vote? Are folks, are we feeling like we want to vote on the priorities as listed right now? Do we want to, because I really hear you asking us to say, now what, right? And so that's a really important piece for us to do what we need to do to give that direction, and then also to do our best to find those resources in a tough situation.
I think I would add that, in serving on the grad requirements committee, I think the one thing that seems clear to me in terms of dealing with that is that by the time our students are coming to us in ninth grade, that's where they're already not ready. They've already been set up for failure. And so I think I would agree with focusing on our middle school students is important. I did have a couple more questions real quick that I wanted to ask in terms of the time for, I think was the big picture one? Yeah. It talks about the shorter times. I'm wondering, does that meet like the required educational minutes overall?
For the big picture learning model?
Yeah.
Yes, we would have to ensure that it did. Those class times are they don't, that amount of time has a much shorter class schedule there. I believe it's only 4 or 5 typically. It's typically the 4 core classes, and so they're longer class times on those 3 days, but they're focused on those core subjects so that they meet those minimum requirements. I mean, any program that we would have for high school students would have to meet the minimum requirements for for earning credits in graduation.
And I think,
Apply for a waiver.
and I think kind of getting to what Trustee La Cruz was talking about, what I don't know if the best way to phrase this question, but in terms of providing these different priorities or recommendations, I guess, what was the problem that you were trying to solve in terms of trying to develop these opportunities? And I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but.
Yeah, so that goes back a little to the origin of the January 10th meeting. So as, Director De La Cruz mentioned, it kind of came from some requests from the board. And then we tried to make sure, like I started it very explicitly with, there's only one hidden agenda that was completely transparent. We were not going to see and talk about alternative education as a place that we expel and remove, take away, and think of a deficit model about our students. The frame was all about the fact that it's very expansive. And so we weren't actually trying to solve a problem except the most insidious one, which is that the formation of public schooling from its inception has had deficiencies and began in a place of control and assimilation and the loss of people's culture and heritage and sense of identity. So we wanted to begin from the place of how do we restore a sense of ability to move through one's education with purpose? How do we envision environments that invite students to find initiative and agency? And that was one of our biggest themes, was a sense of agency. Didn't matter to us if the students, 12 years old to, well, I imagine my daughter when she was 2 and refused to clean her room, I learned very quickly about agency in a human being right there, right? We wanted our students to feel agency, so we weren't trying to solve a problem besides the larger construction of public schooling to the benefit of our families and students.
If I can speak to the instructional minutes for opportunity programs specifically, if it is set up as an opportunity school, then the minimum instructional minutes are 180. So it is different than traditional classes.
And you asked for like a straw poll, Trustee De La Cruz. Oh, real quick, I was just gonna remind everybody that we're just working towards giving direction, but not necessarily a vote. You had a comment, Trustee La Torre?
So as we continue to have these conversations, I think what's really starting to hit home with me is how these are prioritized and all the work that's put into it, and that there's no one right answer for what we're dealing with. I like the other annotations that were provided about the independent study program. Your personality is your personality. So you are going to typically get a student or a student's family that knows what they need or what they want or what works for them. And the independent study program is going to work better for that student to get what they need. So there could be an option of expanding our ASP program to meet those students' needs that need that, because not all the students are going to need it. But then designing a pilot program around priority 2 that might be able to get to some of these students' more reactionary needs in a middle school environment to help better prepare them for high school. So it's not that we're picking straws for one of these and saying, move in the direction. It's thank you for all these opportunities. Thank you for the work that's put into looking at these different models. And there are bits and pieces of the different models that we might actually get to work on and put into place. Financially, it probably makes more sense with finding ways to expand an ISP program virtually, opposed to building a new lab for a CTE program. So what's in front of us, what's feasible, what's reasonable, and how do we find a little bit of each of these to move forward with?
Trustee Sheffield.
Just wanted to expand a little bit on the feasibility, and we have, Superintendent Trunell had made 2 suggestions in looking at the priorities. I'm wondering within these priorities, 1 and 2, the ISP option and the 7-8 opportunity program, are there things, just looking at priority number 1. Trustee De La Cruz brought up the ADA challenge with that. I'm wondering, is that something that then can be modified? Is there a fix? Can we crack that nut? Can we say, well, maybe we don't go up to 50 students? Why would we go up to 50 students? If there is a simple solution to that one, is that something that we can consider? And I would include that in my recommendation. It's okay. Yep. Okay. I've seen nods.
For funding with independent study, it can't go up to 50 students.
Right.
Yeah. It has to be equivalent to what we have in our other classes as determined at P2.
Right.
As far as on the ADA.
Okay.
So I want to clarify that within that priority, there's actually 4 different models. That 50 was indicated only for teachers. If they had a fully virtual caseload, they could have up to 50. But our current ISP model is a 1-to-25 ratio. So expanding our current ISP model would entail allocating more FTE or hiring another 1 to however many teachers to expand the program and keep the model as it stands with the 1-to-1 meetings, 1 day a week for an hour, 1-to-25 ratio.
Okay.
I think there's some interchangeability that's happening here that is coming from the committee. One is we're talking about independent study that has very clear guidelines for ADA. And then 2, we're talking about virtual learning. And we would have to actually create or designate a virtual school in order to be able to recoup all of the ADA. And currently, we do not have a virtual school created to allow us to do that. And
so
there are specific parameters legally for us to do that.
So is that then creating a virtual school? No, I don't want to say is that a simple solution, but is that a simple solution?
It is not. It comes with its own set of cost analysis.
Okay.
Because you actually have to have a certain depth and breadth of educators to be able to provide that program. You also have to have a brick and mortar location in order to be able to meet with parents and students in person if needed. And so I've led work around this in designing virtual schools. And so it's quite expansive, and
okay, and then
half
cost.
a year just to think about the design for that.
And what about cost?
You have your FTE costs, you still have curriculum. In many cases, virtual schools also have online curriculum. So you're talking about licenses, whether you're going to offer 24/7 tutoring outside of that.
So it sounds less and less feasible.
It may not necessarily be less expensive.
Okay.
It's feasible, but whether it's less expensive or.
Oh, I guess when I'm thinking of feasibility, I'm thinking long-term, short-term.
I will say this because we've had this discussion about, and I've had it with Ms. Howell also, is our competitiveness if we have a virtual school, that could open up an opportunity and draw back students that we could be losing because there are neighboring districts who have a virtual academy of some kind. We would just have to look at the current legalities and requirements to design something like that. And then depending on grade levels, keep in mind that if we're going to offer high school, the virtual school must meet WASC accreditation. And so that's a whole layer that we would have to ensure how students are going to get credits towards graduation and have that be seen as an accredited school.
So then what would be the difference between this and Cyber High?
Cyber High, well, you can probably answer this, Tim.
Cyber High is intentionally used as an opportunity for students who have already experienced learning with the full course. It's an opportunity through a self-paced model to review and then get a chance to do better at something. It's not intended to be its own kind of standalone curriculum the first time through, and truly is geared towards credit recovery and a kind of very narrow slice of helping students say, I need to do better in that course to get the credits that I needed. But it's definitely not about first learning and about kind of or original learning. So
We're also not using online educators. Our own educators are still the teacher of record.
Okay, I have trustee Manietti and trustee McNally. Did you have your hand up?
Just trustee McNally.
Okay.
Just have some quick questions about the independent study program. So I see that in the current model, students can take up to 2 classes on site. And I think that's awesome because, you know, as a teacher, I see all the time those kids that are not doing well most of the day, but they have that one class where they're making connections. So I'm wondering, would that continue with the other models we're considering, like the virtual model? And also, is there any way that we are or that we can encourage that for students to find that 1 or 2 class that they take on site?
thank you for the question. So I think in general, one of the hallmarks of independent study is just the idea and the conception that students have the ability to really stay connected to the school that the comprehensive setting. And so I don't think we'd want to deviate too largely from that unless there was some really explicit reasons that we were trying to create something that met students' needs. I think one of the keys is to allow that flexibility again. And a lot of students, there is potentially one course or something that could draw their interest, and we don't want to limit that. So I think that would be a kind of standard thing to look at moving forward. It's just part of independent studies constructed.
Did you say you had no questions, trustee Manietti? Okay. And any other board questions? I do have a public comment, and I just want to be clear. This is a special study session. Public comment was agendized at the very beginning of the meeting. I'm being flexible in allowing it, but I'm only allowing like 1 per person, just to be fair again. So Chris, you already spoke once, so I'm just limiting it to 1. So then I have Angela.
Hello. I'm an independent studies teacher, and I just want to answer a couple questions that I heard that they weren't quite answered. So we have 5 teachers. We each have 25 kids. We see the kids for an hour a week. They stay with us either in our office or outside in a little area where the kids group together and work together. And if they come every Tuesday at 2, they see the same kids Tuesday at 2 and they become friends. Their kids are open to come anytime they want throughout the week from 8:15 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon to get extra help, whether most of the time for math, but anything. And so they come at the same time with their friends. I'm supposed to be here on Tuesday and I'll show up on Tuesday to see my teacher, but I'm going to show up on Monday because that's when, Susie shows up. So they do have that community. They also can take 1 to 2 classes on campus. It's usually the ones that they enjoy the most. Every now and then they take the one that they struggle with the most because they want that extra help in math or something. So they do that. And so that's nice. What I wanted to say was at the height of our wait list, we had 93. And the only reason why we're at 40 is because as we've been calling them to say, one of my kids graduated, I have a spot, and we call and they're like, oh, we're no longer with Santa Rosa High. We've left. They're at different places. So a lot of the kids that we should have called back in November have been waiting until March and April, and they're no longer available to us because they're no longer in our system. The other thing I wanted to say was, I don't know what else I was going to say. There was something else. I just lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. There There's something very important I wanted to tell you about. Why the kids come. Many of them have high anxiety and they can't make it on a day of campus, not even one class. There's kids that I have that don't go outside at all except to see me for an hour. And I ask them what they did this week. Did they go to Safeway and buy something? Did they go to Starbucks and get a soda or a coffee? No, they don't leave their house. We have kids that are high achievers and they want to go as fast as possible to get through some of the curriculum and then take additional JC classes. And then we have kids that are not necessarily placed with us, but are not allowed on their campuses anymore, and they have chosen to come with us and have really succeeded with us. And I gave one student last quarter an honor certificate for doing so well, and he cried because he hadn't had one since grammar school. And this kid was pretty much kicked out of school last year. So that's my proudest moment.
Thank you. So back to the board, Trustee Flores. I said Flores.
I thought you said Torres. I was like, wait. Who? I just want to say that, program number independent studies, which is priority number 1, right? We know that there is a need for this. As a school counselor, I do see, and I was going to say this earlier, but a couple of you said it, and thank you for saying that a lot of our students are suffering from social and emotional issues due to COVID, isolation, and other mitigating factors, right? So that's one thing. So I think it's important, to expand a program that has already, shown that is, effective, right? But I think it's important for us to start thinking outside the, I'm not saying to get rid of, I'm saying expand independent studies because we need that, right? Because we don't want to lose, those students. But at the same time, it's important for us to start thinking about what other programs can we implement to attract the students that don't fit in an independent studies program, for example, right? And that are choosing to leave our district, right? So I think we have an opportunity here, right? From all these, from the other programs, right? To choose maybe 1 or 2 or a hybrid of these, right? To give, our staff some guidance as to where to go. And I like to start, and I like to, go back to what Trustee De La Cruz mentioned, which is I think it's time for us to start doing a straw vote as to what sort of things it is that we need to do. And I'd like to start by saying that I think we should expand, independent studies, right? That's 1. 2, it's important. So I have like 3 priorities, okay? 2 is to ensure that students in the middle school levels get the extra scaffolding that they need in order to be successful in high school, right? It's too late. You're right. It's too late by the time they're entering 9th grade, right? And they may be falling in math or other skills, right? So we need to make sure we need to ensure that they have those skills. So some sort of scaffolding method or program in the middle schools. And thirdly, I think it's important to develop a program where, students who have told us one way or another that a comprehensive or traditional high school or middle school is not what works for them, right? And I see, a CTE program in here, for example, right? A magnet CTE program. I see big picture learning. Big picture learning, is not necessarily just a continuation school. I've seen it very successful being implemented as a comprehensive high school program, right? To attract those students who may not necessarily think that, or may not necessarily, have shown us that high school, traditional high school has not worked for them. So, I mean, that is my priority in terms of, what I like our district to go, right? Because I do have a lot of students in Healdsburg, for example, that leave because they want independent studies, and we don't have that in Healdsburg. And they go to Windsor, they come to Santa Rosa City Schools, and then they're a wait list here, right? So they stay in limbo, and those are students with high, SEL sort of needs, right? I don't know if that's much of a straw vote. I'll give you 3 priorities. So
Yeah.
Not on 3.
So as long as Superintendent Turnell's or whoever's capturing that so that they could kind of understand, I'll assume, yeah. So how about we go Trustee De La Torre and then all the way around this way individually, and you just kind of give your thoughts on which priorities are more important to you. So how about you next, Trustee De La Torre?
Top 3?
Sure. Or 2 or 1?
My top 3 would be 2, 3, and 5.
In that order. Trustee Manieri?
Yes, my top 3, sorry, I'm just gonna say the names because I'm going back and forth with the numbers, it's confusing me. Expanding the independent study program, and a pilot program. I would love to see a pilot program for the grade 7-8 opportunity program.
Trustee McNally?
Welcome back.
Okay. I haven't been able to see you all night, so it's like, I didn't even know you were gone. I'm
We
sorry.
had the screens here.
Yeah.
In the middle, if you look, you just saw Yes.
Trustee De La Cruz, you want to go again?
Two priorities are the middle school opportunity program is my first priority, and second is an expansion of independent study. Do we, I guess with this a question too, do we currently have middle school independent study? Yes, Angela? Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I appreciate the focus on middle school again with the expansion of independent study. So in that order, opportunity, independent study.
Yes, in order, priority 1 and then priority 2. I'm going to add priority 5 because I know there's already a lot of work that we're doing around CTE, but we sure would like to see that kind of be, if we're looking for priority areas, I would really like to see a heavy focus on expanding CTE.
Okay. In terms of priorities, I would go 215. I did want to add that I was curious as to whether one could maybe, like, if there's the ability to maybe modify what we have in an existing place to maybe meet some of these needs, but maybe as something to look into. But, you know, with 2, that cost seems really high, so I'm very curious as to how we would get it done. But in terms of direction, 215 for me. So then with that, I would ask Superintendent, do you kind of have an idea of direction or do you need more?
Thank you, everyone, for your guidance. What we'll do is come together as a team and talk about how this comes back to the Alternative Education Committee. But I think we have a good sense of where we start first and go next, so that we can also produce results that demonstrate that we're not just talking about it, but that we're going to actually take action, which means that as we engage in our budget conversations right now, including LCAP, we have to think about what the costs may be and how we're going to make room for that and what gets removed in order to make room for that.
I think the only thing I'll sort of kind of want to add about this meeting, it's a special study session. One of the things in Vice President Flores and I, along with Superintendent Turnell, kind of discussed that, you know, our regular board meetings are just so long, we don't get to really talk about stuff. So we decided, let's try to have some special study sessions to actually be able to get into some of these things. With that said, you know, I think it may not seem like it, but input is really important to me. I do want to make sure that we're kind of consistent in process. I don't want to set precedents where I'm being very unfair to some people in terms of the long term. So I just want that to be out there. But I think as we go on to continue to have more study sessions like we will have on May 17th, another one, or 15th. Oh, yeah, 15th. Sorry. I think if folks see, our partners see stuff on the agenda and you think you might want to be part of the conversation, reach out to the superintendent, see if maybe that's something that could be possible. I don't know, it'll depend on the issue, but,
President Medina, could you just clarify what the procedure is for special meetings with regard to public comment? So it's not public comment after every
right.
topic being discussed?
So in special meetings, there's public comment in advance of closed session for any closed session items. Then we recess, and then there's going to be public comment in advance of any discussion and/or action items. That public comment is to comment on any of the items on the public agenda. And today I did allow flexibility to allow some public comment after that initial period.
Can I suggest something? Of
course.
Medina? I think your input's invaluable for sure, right? But whenever we have committees that were involved, if we can have maybe one representative from the committee, so that way, if we have questions, we can, they can have the opportunity to answer those.
I think that's a great suggestion.
Outside of admin, yes.
They're all on the
Right, exactly.
I think, it just goes back to, I think we wanted to create better partnership and collaboration with everybody in our team. And so it would go towards that. But in terms of today, I just really don't want to create any bad precedents for the future. Go ahead, Trish.
I'd just like to add to the point of the study sessions is to give the board more chance to interact on a topic, right? To be more in that mode of not necessarily taking action, but to really look at all the angles of things. And so we put the public comment at the beginning so that we can hear from the public, but it's not an opportunity to answer questions that the board is asking. That could actually be deemed a Brown Act violation if the board were to continue to engage with someone who is at the microphone making public comment, which is why in this case, because it's more engaging in a study session, we have offered the opportunity at the beginning, just to give the board room just to have that discussion amongst themselves. I appreciate the flexibility today, knowing that we're still trying to set what our regular cadence is and bringing public comment, and I'm grateful that we were able to give that opportunity to those who weren't there at the beginning of the meeting.
With that said, meeting adjourned.